Why would I return to a country where I was convicted of murder? Because in order to move forward, I need to go back.
The twisted tale of Amanda Knox starts perfectly, with just the right tone and sensitivity for the story we are about to hear. We see Knox trembling in fear under a blanket. This is the opposite response to being suspected of murder, whether you are innocent or not. So the documentary gets an A+ for recognizing this, and if Amanda Knox executive produced it, she gets an A+ as well for recognizing that the appropriate emotion when someone has been murdered and you are being questioned is fear. The only problem, and it's really a little gripe, I wouldn't call it a vicious criticism, is that the tearful Amanda we see under the blanket is the exonerated Knox from 2022.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
I'm not sure I understand. Knox has just performed a comedy skit where she's laughing about the case, laughing about being a suspect. So now we're back to that whole inappropriate conversation all over again. So the question is she scared or isn't she? Was she scared or wasn't she? Is this the appropriate tone or isn't it? And also, in a lot of the media, you see these words that Amanda Knox is reclaiming her story for the first time. Well, didn't she do that when she wrote Waiting to be Heard, where she was paid $4 million, a record at the time? And wasn't that the point of the PR that was hired, the PR firm, a really powerful PR firm that was hired 9 days after the incident? What was all that PR doing, if not claiming the story or telling the story the way her parents and the way the Knoxes wanted it told? So how can you say at this point she's telling her story for the first time? And that's sort of the problem with Amanda Knox. There seem to be two Amanda Knoxes. Even when it's Amanda Knox on Amanda Knox, there seems to be another Amanda Knox as well. But I digress. The twisted tale of Amanda Knox starts perfectly, but at the wrong time, because that's not how Knox's story actually started. I do think there's some clever mindfuckery at work here. You start off with someone cowering and afraid. That's how the story opens. And then the next thing, there's a brief intro and time and place jumps sort of out of the proper chronology until it sort of settles on the day after Meredith's murder, the morning after, late into the morning. Why are we not going instead to the night of the incident so we can see what Amanda was doing in detail? Why don't we start there? So all in all, it's quite disorienting, and because of that, it's easy to miss that the most important part and the most critical part is, of course, the part Knox says she can't really remember. So how do you tell the story about how you aren't guilty of murder if you couldn't remember it then? Do you just leave it out? Now, as I promised in the title, this is going to be a vicious dissection of these episodes. And the vicious thing I'm going to start off with is by simply asking you to compare photos of the real Amanda and the footage of the real Amanda, and to a lesser extent, the descriptions of the real Amanda with Amanda's descriptions of herself in this dramatization. And the vicious aspect I want you to look into is whether the tone of these descriptions match. Is the traumatized, crying, quivering person the same person we see in authentic material of Amanda Knox in Perugia at the time? So really what we want to do is match settings, those dramatized with those that are real, such as in the prison and in police custody, with those that were published in the media or recorded in situ, and then simply ask, is the dramatization accurate to the footage? Is it a match? Is it authentic? And if it isn't, which one is fake? And if one is fake, why is it fake? So it's really vicious stuff. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'll be following this up with the next episode in the Ramsey case, dealing with Larry Mason, another one of the peripheral figures, so look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So let's look at 10 terrible and terrifying observations from the first 10 minutes of episode 1. Now I want to start with the first 10 minutes, but use the same mindfuckery technique and go out of order, except I want to start with what ought to be the priority. So let's start with a screen grab from the very end of the scene where Knox visits her home. Now, in the story, Meredith is dead inside her room, behind a locked bedroom door, and Knox implies in Twisted Tale that she was simply unaware of this. And so that brings us to number 1, what is wrong with this picture? Well, besides the white halo above her head, why is Knox dressed so not warmly for November in Italy? In fact, later that day, Raffaele would loan her his jacket because she was cold. And if she headed home, right, she headed home from his house, why not get warm clothes to begin with? That's where her clothing is, right? In fact, by the time the cops and the media were at the house and Knox and Celeste were seen canoodling outside, she was already wearing his jacket. Now, why doesn't she have her own jacket? And this also raises an interesting, if almost contradictory question. Why is he warmly dressed, but not her? I mean, he's even wearing a scarf. And the clothing narrative is quite interesting because while the story was still breaking, Knox was seen by the press buying lingerie. And we also hear one of the first things her mother says when she visits Knox in jail, that she brought her some warm clothes. Now, I know what you're thinking, nothing to see here, but give me a moment. In her email to friends dated November 4th, a long email that must have taken about an hour to write, and this is just a handful of days after the murder, Knox mentions clothes twice. This is the first instance. So she's had a chance to grab a change of clothes. Why doesn't she dress appropriately for their trip to Gubbio? The second mention of clothing is the reference to buying lingerie, which she also seems to feel she has to explain. Now, what you don't see when Knox enters the villa is the washing machine. That's not depicted. Or that it's still full of clothing, and the switch is on. Reddit also have a few thoughts on that aspect of the narrative. Now, when someone does washing in the middle of a murder, like we saw in the Morphew case, the Jodi Arias case, the Ramsey case, O.J. Simpson, and even to some extent in the McCann case, I think we need to look at things a little more carefully. Anyway, on to number 2. In the trailer, which we saw at the beginning of this episode, Knox is depicted as traumatized while in police custody. Well, what is wrong with that picture? Well, it's just that there are so many pictures of her in police custody, not only not looking traumatized, but looking downright giddy, actually smiling, even laughing. And so I get the tone of these images, given the story that's been told, is appropriate, right? These pictures. But let's have a look at some other photos. Now, these images correspond to the outfits we see in the dramatization. Knox appears at the very most subdued in these press photos, hardly hurt or in despair, as Twisted Tale depicts her. In fact, I think one is very hard-pressed to find photos of Knox looking like she's crying or traumatized when she's in police custody. But what about other photos of Knox in police custody? And I assure you there are hundreds, if not thousands. Have a look at these. Is this Amanda Knox depicted in the documentary? That's just 5 images, but there are 10 times more if you'd like to do your own research. Is this Amanda Knox reflected in Twisted Tale? Maybe she is. I haven't so far watched more than 10 minutes, but so far she isn't. Let me know if the smiling Amanda Knox, in this situation is depicted. I mean, this, see below, is more appropriate, and this is from reality, bar perhaps the Beatles hoodie she has in her hand and that she wore in court. That brings us to the next one. What's with the hooded crow? Where did she get that from? Some of you may know that I wrote a trilogy of books that had a crow as an almost central character, and obviously I wrote 2 trilogies on Amanda Knox. I guess I find it a little hinky that she used the same device I used in her story. I mean, what is the point? maybe just a wild coincidence, just an observation, but I mean, if we're going to talk about mindfuckery, let's talk about mindfuckery. That brings us to the next point, number 4. That's what I'm talking about, Foxy Noxy. Twisted Tales sort of admits that it wasn't the evil media who came up with this terrible, terrible nickname for poor Amanda Knox. It was her soccer mates in Seattle. What's not really admitted, at least as far as I can tell so far, as far as I've watched, is that it was Knox that took on the Foxy Noxy nickname. Often you hear about her just sort of crying about how horrible it was that they called her Foxy Noxy. It was such a horrible thing to endure. But she actually took on the Foxy Noxy nickname, apparently liked it enough to use it on her own MySpace page. So accusing the media of calling her sexualizing names when she seemed to be having fun with it herself seems a little unfair. Number 5, Amanda's parties in Seattle. I'm glad that Knox depicts herself having parties in Seattle because she did. But again, it's not what she depicts, but what she doesn't depict. That's the issue here. And so I do think the question arises when Knox parties and, disturbances sometimes happen, leading to the police being called. Is it no big deal? I mean, have you had parties where the police were called and you were the person that was sort of responsible or held responsible? Is this a case that it's no harm, no foul, or harm and foul play? And I guess another analogy for this is if you think about the Idaho 4 case and you think about those parties and you think about the fact that the police were summoned to those parties several times, I'm certainly not trying to imply that the victims in that case got what they deserved or anything like that. Simply that the parties were so loud and rowdy that it sort of got the attention of other people besides the police and may have attracted, for the lack of a better word, evil into that whole fabric. I just think it's an interesting thing to consider. Knox introduces Meredith last when inside the villa. If Amanda Knox loved the actress who portrayed her, and if that actress suggests that Knox is a beautiful woman, then I'm not sure the same effort went into Meredith's portrayal. And I want you to think about that. Do you think the same effort went into casting Meredith's actress that went into casting Amanda Knox? This may seem like a silly observation, but it's perhaps the most pertinent of all. Because the question has come up repeatedly, was Knox jealous of Meredith? Did they get along? How well did they actually get along? And so on. Did you know that both Knox and Meredith had the hots for an Italian boy, for the same boy, a boy who lived downstairs? His name was Giacomo Salenzi, but Giacomo chose Meredith. And Meredith said something to her like, well, you can have him, which is something Meredith didn't appreciate. Is that depicted in this documentary? That's something else Knox seems to leave out, the fact that Meredith and Knox didn't get along very well. That's what she told her own family and her friends. And I think what is shown there very, very briefly is Knox licking a plate and people looking at her quizzically. Was it as innocent and whimsical and superficial and no big deal as that? And so how come Knox has got a different version of this to what Meredith told her own family and her friends? And I do think there was a contest, this is my personal opinion, I think there was a contest that developed between Knox and Meredith, a popularity contest between Meredith and Knox and the girls in their orbit, which Knox lost, and also a contest with the boys, which arguably Knox lost as well. Now, if you're listening to this and saying, well, I really think that is ridiculous, and what are you talking about? Well, you've got to think back to when you were 20 years old, for example, the age of the victims in the Idaho case, and how important social standing is and who your friends are, and that you are invited to certain parties, and when you're not invited, how that feels. And Knox actually wasn't invited to a party just prior to Meredith's murder, Halloween. And we know she wanted to be, and we know that Meredith and her friends did have this party. And Knox was this big party person to the extent that even the police were called. And then just before this murder, there is this big party celebration, something that that really brings expats together, and where is Knox in that continuum? So, these themes many of you think are a joke, about what is appropriate and what isn't shown and what is, are actually far more pertinent than many of you have probably ever realized. When you are at that age, image and impressions are everything. It's also interesting how Knox barely gives 2 seconds of airtime to Meredith's British friends. Again, she wants the story to be about her, but it's impressive just how little it is about them. After all, didn't they, in a sense, have a similar experience to Knox? They also went to Perugia. They were also questioned by police. They also ended up leaving the country and their studies prematurely. What about their stories? And so how come this is a story all about Amanda Knox and no one else when there were so many other people? So I don't think it's an accident that the actress depicting Meredith is meant to depict her in an understated way, because the whole idea is that Knox is the star of the show, not Meredith, and even less so her friends. The actress playing Meredith is meant to play second fiddle to the actress playing Knox, but I suspect it was the other way around in real life. I mean, Meredith had appeared in a music video, Knox hadn't. Meredith had a proper scholarship. She was an Erasmus scholar. Knox was doing a Piffly language course. Meredith knew how to mix cocktails. Knox apparently didn't. Meredith this, Knox that. So you can imagine if Meredith had all of this influence and Knox and Meredith had a falling out, well then the fun levels for one of them could certainly plunge, and isn't that what happened? So it is interesting, but not surprising, in this depiction that Knox herself has a hand in, while Knox is beautiful and adorable, less so Meredith, etc. And in many of the first scenes showing both of them, Knox is shown physically above Meredith. There's also an interesting scene where Meredith and an unknown male ask Knox for condoms, and Knox looks down on both of them from an upstairs window. Now, I've read Knox's book, and I don't believe she ever mentioned this in it, and frankly, I have a hard time believing Meredith would ask for condoms so publicly with a guy standing next to her. I just don't think that's the sort of person she was. If you want to appreciate how attractive Meredith really was, have a look at this photo of her sister Stephanie in court. And by the way, that's the appropriate way to be in court. Number 7, the morning of November 2nd starts at 10:13 a.m. What's up with that? If you want to neatly excise, I don't know, roughly 50% of what was covered at trial, the way to do that would be to start your story at 10:13 a.m. Incidentally, in her email to friends and family, she's also quite clear that she was up late that morning at around 10:30 a.m. But witnesses in court said they saw her or recognized her much earlier than that. Again, there are 2 versions here of Amanda Knox. Which one is real? While it may be true that Knox and Celeste slept till 10:30, even though they had plans to go to Gubbio that day, apparently the laptop woke up a lot earlier, about 5 hours earlier, and started to play some music. Number 8, the mark on her neck. I was pleasantly surprised to see that the actress playing Knox showed herself with a red mark on her neck on the morning after the murder. Well, at first I saw it and then I didn't see it, so I'm not sure if I was imagining things. But anyway, you can see it here in documented footage from real life. Okay, look closer.
Closer, please. Closer.
That mark was actually part of the investigation. Knox's Italian housemate brought it up, and the mark itself was actually photographed by the police, as you can see in this image. Chris Watts had a similar-ish looking mark on the side of his neck as well. The bloody shoe print. Again, what we're doing is we are just comparing what we see depicted and reality. And I know it's very vicious criticism, this. So the dramatization shows a subtle but actually obvious bloody print on the kitchen floor. In reality, the shoe prints were almost invisible, all of them. Have a look at this image. Here's the part that's interesting though. If the killer fled with his shoes on, why was there a bare footprint in blood in the bathroom? Was there more than one killer, or did the killer, who was naked, put his shoes on after committing the crime? What intruder takes his shoes off when he's in the middle of a crime, then puts them on again? It was speculated and argued during the trial that the footprint made in blood on the blue shower mat was too small for Rudy Gaudet, too big for Amanda Knox, but some felt it was a match for Solicito. Mopping up operation. When Twisted Tail first starts twisting the tail or tail twisting, in terms of the elements of the crime scene, it starts with this image. It's Solicito's flooded kitchen floor. It's interesting, on that day of all days, a lot of mopping up needs to take place. They sleep late and are in no hurry to sort this out until, when they wake up. And then this is what their priority becomes, within the context of blood, poop, and Meredith going silent. Her door being locked and not answering her phone. This is the emergency that they are paying attention to. Amanda Knox used a mop to clean up on the morning after the murder, but not the crime scene. When the police encountered her, the mop was perhaps not in hand, but it was basically moving around that morning between her apartment and his. Another mop that made a weird out-of-place appearance at a crime scene was the one outside Scott Peterson's kitchen door. Now, the mop wouldn't have anything to do with just one shoe print left in blood in the middle of the kitchen floor as depicted, as dramatized, would it? In the next episode, I want to deal in more depth with Knox's version of herself entering the cottage, and specifically how and when she calls for Meredith. Is there anything wrong with that picture? If so, do you know what it is? Also, if you'd like me to continue this vicious critique of Twisted Tail, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.